the first question was, how would you summarize the essence of Proust as a writer to someone who hasn't read him? Some people are laughing because they think this is a ridiculous question.
100% why you're laughing. I mean, that's the kind of, can you hear me? Yeah.
Speak really like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of question that has me heading straight for the exit, because it's strictly impossible, and not only because of the challenge of extracting in synoptic form a so-called essence of a 7-volume, this massive novel, and not only because it's absolutely intrinsic to the whole experience of reading Proust that one forgets, and one forgets over and over. I mean, forgetting and remembering represents or describes the fundamental dimension of the recherche itself. That is what happens in the recherche and what happens to us as readers. And then finally, just, I mean, there are so many obstacles to engaging with this otherwise fantastically interesting question, is that Proust's world, his fictional world, is a world in a state of constant flux and change. It's multiform, it's heterogeneous, and for that fundamental reason alone is resistant to the synoptic approach. However, I'll have a go at it, partly because I retain an affectionate attachment to a crazy party game that some of you in the room may be familiar with. By one of those miraculous coincidences, the initials are identical with those of Marcel Proust, namely the Monty Python party game that challenged those participating to summarize à la recherche du temps perdu in no more than 15 seconds. Now, I'm very fond of that mad moment. Obviously, I'm not going to try anything like that myself, but since you've invited me, Alice, here's what I have to offer, and it's by way of reference to somebody else. It's a journalist, and an English journalist and broadcaster, a very famous one, called Andrew Marr. One of his radio broadcasts was in part about, many years ago, it was in part about Proust, and he attempted a summary, and it went as follows, and I remain deeply attached to it. À la recherche du temps perdu is a book about a man reflecting on what it is to be alive. And I think that's a very good summary, and it takes me, of course, to one of the terms of the title of my own book, Living and Dying with Marcel Proust, and I'm happy to talk a little about what interested me in relation to that first term, living, if you want me to.
Well, we're going to get onto that, but first I want to lay out kind of 3 versions of Proust. We have the more modernist version, we have who you describe as a therapeutic Proust, and then we have a more traditional Proust. Can you talk about Proust as he relates to modernism and himself as a modernist?
Yes. I mean, Proust as modernist is an intriguing topic and very apropos, since we're in 2022, which earlier referred to as the 1922 is often billed as the year that made modernism, and of course it's also the centennial of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses. So all the bits in a temporal perspective fall together rather well here. Modernist Proust, well, it entails many things, involves many things. One has to do fundamentally with something implied by my title, Living with Marcel Proust, the living world as perceived principally through the human sense, the human sensorium, and that places him in, although Proust's novel is not a classic modernist stream of consciousness novel in the manner of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, this nevertheless places him in their company. So that would be one way of talking about modernist Proust. Another way, which may be more familiar to you all, is the Proustian experiments with time, with the temporality of the world and the temporality of narrative, and all the interesting experiments he runs along those lines, broadly in connection with 2 expressions that appear in the Recherche itself. One is called, incidentally, I should say that throughout I'll mostly be quoting Proust in English translation, given the nature of the venue, but what in the novel is called the form of time, and the other expression is the order of time. By the order of time, Proust really means quantified, measurable time, the time of the clock, the time of the watch, the time of the calendar, the time of the anniversary, and he plays absolute havoc, and deliberately, by intention and endlessly interestingly, with the order of time, by all the detours and retrogressions and all the disruptions of the normal chronology of time as we normally understand it. The other expression, the form of time, is something that is connected in various ways I haven't got time to go into here, with Bergson's notion of le temps vécu. The form of time for Proust is time as it is subjectively experienced. And he runs all sorts of quasi-modernist experiments with that as well. Although some have billed him, modernist Proust in relation to the representation of time with, they've called him the Einstein of modern literature. This is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, Proust was flattered when somebody he knew very well wrote an article comparing the temporal modalities of the Recherche to those of Einsteinian relativity theory, who wouldn't be flattered, but at the same time he went on to confess that he hadn't the faintest idea or understanding what relativity theory looked like. So that's about as far as you can get with that. Okay, the third image you mentioned.
So we're going to get back to this question of experimentation with narrative and time, but I would like you to just briefly tell us about Therapeutic, Proust, and a more traditional version of Proust, and then we'll get back to them in more detail, but just kind of lay it out for us.
Yes, I mean, one of the huge, sorry, this is trivial and childish, but one of the huge problems of talking about Proust and time is that we haven't got enough time. We're just going to run out of it very, very, very fast. So we don't want that to usurp all these other interesting topics you mentioned, Alice. Sorry, what was the first one?
So Therapeutic Proust,
Oh, Therapeutic Proust. Oh,
I just want to quote you here. You say, looking to Proust for answers to the questions, for example, of how to be in love, how to suffer successfully, rapidly induce a loss of the will to live.
In me, yes.
Not readers of, there are books that how to have a good life reading Proust, etc.
There's a school of thought, if I can put it like that, represented by one book in particular, which I suppose I have to name, and you may or may not be familiar with it, called How Proust Can Change Your Life by Alain de Botton. And the essence of that book is that Marcel Proust's great novel belongs more appropriately on the self-help shelves of your local bookstore than the literary shelves. And that implication is instantiated by some of the chapter titles of that book and the arguments that flow from those titles. Alice has just mentioned some of them. How to love success, how to be in love. Of all the literary works that consistently speak of the experience of love as an unmitigated disaster from which there is no exit and for which there is no solution other than one very particular kind of love, and that itself is problematical, the mother-son relationship, which is fundamental to the novel, but anything that involves love in the sense of the sexual relationship, all of you who've read Proust will know that it is a disaster zone. The idea that it teaches you how to be in love, well, you understand immediately why I lost the will to live when I came across that. But there are other examples, and I won't go into them, but the worst of all, sorry, Alain de Botton, but I'm afraid I cannot contain myself when this question is put to me. Another chapter is titled How to Suffer Successfully, as if Marcel Proust was a modernist successor to the ancient Stoics. Well, that is absolutely for the birds. But having said all that, there are some stories which I tell in this book There are three in particular, but we haven't got that much time, so I'll just refer to two of them, where therapeutic Proust does seem to have a certain meaningfulness. One concerns, those of you familiar with Proust remember that one of the major ailments of the novel and of Proust's own life is the condition of insomnia, of just simply not being able to sleep. I mean, like a radical form of insomniac illness. And when I was a student, an undergraduate at Oxford, I got to know another student, not that well, but anyway, who suffered from chronic insomnia. And it went on for ages and ages until he found a solution. And the solution was, guess what? To read a couple of pages of Proust every night. And that would send him off. And I often wondered what the actual composition of the cure was. My best guess is it was the syntax. I mean, it was those sentences. I mean, you know, they can send you off to Dodo Land any day of the week, depending what sort of state you're in. But the other condition, which was one that spoke to me more profoundly, I was at a conference some years ago in Venice, and where I met a psychotherapist who told me the following story, the story of a friend of hers who was also a patient who suffered from chronic asthma, psychologically induced asthmatic illness. And guess what the solution, and of course, asthma is probably the greatest Proustian illness of them all. It's what killed him at the end. It's what nearly killed him when he was a young boy. And it features, if only sporadically, in the novel, or various forms of respiratory illness or even crisis. Well, this friend of this psychoanalyst individual I met in Venice told me the following story, that she was chronically ill with asthmatically, and the solution to it, she self-cured by reading Marcel Proust, page by page, out loud. Now, to read Proust silently is already a challenge, but to read Proust out loud, sentence by sentence, page by page, and for that to cure you of the very illness that you'd think reading Proust out loud would actually trigger in you was a miracle. So while I have no time in general for the concept of therapeutic Proust, there are some exceptions.
Right. So, and you write, Chris, in the book, not the cure that becomes the poison, but the poison that paradoxically becomes the cure. In this case.
Oh yeah, I play a little bit in the book, perhaps a little too fancifully with Plato's pharmakon. The pharmakon is, of course, in the ancient Greek, has a double meaning, is that which can cure you, but also that which can kill you.
And let's just lay out this third kind of viewpoint of Proust, which is a more traditional Proust, one who is part of a 17th century tradition, 19th century tradition, the coming of age novel, the education novel, the apprenticeship novel. Can you tell us about this more traditional viewpoint?
Yes, I mean, although when thinking of Proust's way with narrative, the telling of a story, basically, and there's a lot to say about the Proustian modality of storytelling, and it's a much neglected topic relative to all the other topics of, you know, involuntary memory, sexuality, and so on. Anyway, what was I going to say? Oh yes, Proust. We think of Proust within the framework of modernism, but there is also a traditional Proust. Proust belongs to several traditions, and two in particular that I highlight in the book or mentioned to Alice. One has to do with the nature of Proust's prose. His prose style is immensely complex and varied and susceptible of many descriptions, but one of the descriptions involves the extent to which his prose style is steeped in the history of French literary prose from roughly the 17th century onwards, and especially that dimension of his writing which involves the maxim. I mean, the À la recherche du temps perdu is, among many other things, a non-stop maxim generating machine, and it can actually drive you round the bend. I mean, he just keeps on and on spewing out these maxims as if he were the second coming of La Rochefoucauld. But it is steeped in the history of French literary and analytical prose. But the other respect in which it belongs in a tradition is the one you allude to there, Alice, is the tradition of what in German is called the Bildungsroman, the education novel or the apprenticeship novel, as it's variously otherwise known, which basically tells the story beginning normally with a young man. It's very rarely a young girl, of a young man, and the tale of a journey through life, which is a progression towards the discovery and the embrace of a vocation. The great model for this, of course, is Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, but it's a tradition that runs and ramifies in all kinds of literary historical directions. And Proust, the story of the Recherche, is fundamentally that. It's about the journey of a young narrator towards the discovery and embrace, finally in the last volume, of the literary vocation.
And possibly the novel we've just read. I mean, having written the novel
Yeah,
we've just read.
well, that's highly
debated.
That is highly debatable and debated. But to cut a very long story short, there are those, and I include myself in that company, of the view that the novel, the narrator goes on, when he finally makes the discovery in the last volume that that is what he is going to be, and to which he will devote what remains of his life, a writer, and he's going to write a novel. And the novel he is going to write is the novel that we have just read. But there are some who dispute that.
Let's go back, Chris, to this idea of the human sensorium to which you alluded. You write in the book of this bodily bundle, and you say it's spread across a geography made of 5 different sensory terrains without clear borders. This is kind of known as the Proust effect, and he calls it himself transposed sensation. So it's the slippage between smell, taste, touch, sight, and hearing. Can you tell us about the Proust effect?
Well, the Proust effect is actually an expression that's been coined, interestingly, by neurology. And it's been adopted in some of the analytical descriptions of cognition. And the core element of this branch of neuropsychology, quasi-appropriating Proust, but it's not just Proust, there are other literary examples, is the phenomenon of so-called synesthesia. It's the synesthetic universe that is very richly populated in Proust's novel, whereby one kind of sensation, taste, for example, well, crucially taste, because the real story begins with the dipping of a Madeleine in a cup of lime blossom tea, and then we're off to the Proustian races. I mean, everything that happens in the novel thereafter is basically a consequence of that initial moment. And the Madeleine episode is distinctive for all sorts of reasons. The one I've just described, I mean, it's the foundation stone of the whole book. But it's also multidimensional from a sensorial point of view, that he experiences when he puts the Madeleine in the tilleul and tastes it, all sorts of things happen to him, not just to him psychologically, the triggering of memories of a buried past, le temps perdu, deemed to have been definitively lost forever, but which then returns. But also all sorts of interesting sensorial things happens. He starts to see colors, and it's the gustatory that has triggered the visual. And that is a very clear and plain example of the synesthetic. Of course, there's a tradition that precedes Proust, and he will have in part inherited this tradition for his own synesthetic purposes, mainly Baudelaire. Baudelaire is the great poet of 19th century French poet of the synesthetic, and Proust went to school with Baudelaire to a very large extent.
Yeah, you have this lovely moment right before you discuss the color pink. And so you describe the narrator's desire to kiss her cheeks is now expressed as the longing to know the taste of a color I had so often contemplated. And then you ask, what is the taste of a color? And inversely, what is the color of a taste?
Yeah, well, I don't have any answer to those questions, but I mean, that's another domain in which Proustian synesthesia manifests itself. the way of color, the color of a bodily part can then be experienced as something that you, if you don't actually taste it, you certainly want to. And this is where synesthesia drifts over into the world of sexuality. And specifically, well, synesthesia in the color dimension is the one that you are now alluding to, Alice. Proust, well, I don't know, sorry, I'm starting to wander here. I don't know where to begin, let alone end with the, Proust was a fully paid up card-carrying member of the chromophiliacs party. And it's an addiction he acquired to a very large extent from reading and agreeing with, reading, translating and agreeing with Ruskin's color theories. So his interest in color was multidimensional, which is why the synesthetic will come into the story at various junctures. But you highlight pink in particular. One thing I talk about in the book, one thing I say in the book, there's a whole chapter on Proust and Proust's color world. The one thing I refused to do was try to construct a hierarchy of Proustian color preferences. How would you do that? Proust blue, Proust green, well, less so than the blue, Proust reds. I mean, Proust whites, his grays, his blacks, I could go on and on. But the standout for me, partly because of a passage from Baudelaire's art criticism, that he quotes in the great essay on Baudelaire in Contre Sainte-Beuve, that Baudelaire, according to Proust, is the great inventor of modern colors. And the standout color of the list of colors that Proust provides for us is pink. So I think, well, let's go for a little walk with pink. And it ended up occupying most of the relevant chapter. And but pink, amongst many other things, of course, is intimately associated with the living world by way of the experience of human flesh. It also works metaphorically in the jeunes filles en fleurs, who appear for the first time in the second volume, are perceived as flowers, as roses. And of course, in French, rose is the flower, but it's also the color pink. And the first thing about Albertine, that apart from her very strange eyes, that draws him to her, of course, are her pink cheeks, which he wants to taste.
So great, let's go back to taste. And I want to go to chapter 3, which is called Coffee and Croissants for a Change, in which you demystify and dethrone the Madeleine, the novel's supreme edible object. You write, before we succumb once again to the temptations of Madeleine worship, we might want to bear in mind that it is but one confection among several. Tell us, Chris, about the sheer contingency in the whole business of the Madeleine, as you put it.
Yeah, that's a long story, but I'll be as brief as I possibly can. I mean, first of all, briefly sketch context. Of course, anybody writing a book about Proust has at some point or other to talk about the damn Madeleine, but there comes a moment when you think, God, I've had enough of Madeleines, and Jesus, I've had enough of the cult of the Proustian Madeleine. And, you know, we all go to Illier, which is the real life location of Cambrai, and where there is a patisserie, and the front window has Proust Madeleine, and you know, and you go and you buy Madeleines and you pop them like there's a drug, and you think you're switching on an instant epiphany machine. All that junk that swirls around the Madeleine cult. But I wasn't just talking about the Madeleine, it had a context. It is the supreme comestible of the Recherche. It's not the only one. Proust's food world is very, very interesting. The best place to be, in my opinion, and I say so in the book, in my own book, The Living and Dying, that the best place to be in the Recherche, it's not Balbec, it's not the stately home of the Guermantes or anything like that. It's Françoise's kitchen, and she's a superlative cook. We're given a very long list of her culinary masterpieces, and I could go on and on about this, but the one that stands out, of course, is her bœuf aux carottes, which even the cold-hearted, clapped-out diplomat Nolpois, when invited to dinner at the Guermantes, at the narrator's family home, goes into a kind of swoon. I mean, this is the closest you'll ever get to ecstasy. And he confers this wonderful compliment on it, and so on and so on. And then there are these riffs the food riffs, the great riff on asparagus. I mean, Françoise's asparagus dish is a masterpiece, but it also generates what is basically on Proust's part, or the narrator's part, an exercise in literary still life. It's a still life prose poem, as is the view of the hotel dining room in Balbec. And that got me working on the food theme and going in a direction I'd never anticipated going in. But there is a moment in the Balbec episode of the hotel dining room when the narrator's staring at all the stuff on the dining table, and he goes into a riff that ends with the expression, la vie profonde des natures mortes. And this idea that still life would have a deep life is a prima facie a paradox and a contradiction in terms, but that really intrigued me, and it took me to Proust's essay on Chardin, and indeed elsewhere, and I wanted to explore it further by way of still life painting, and investigate the following question: whether there is, via Proust's interest in still life, an ontology, and even to refer here to my distinguished colleague with us this evening, Philippe Descola, his book, Les Formes du Visible, and his interest in what is called an animist ontology. And I want to figure out whether there is such a thing in Proust, but I haven't yet started working on it. That's a project yet to be. Anyway, we come to the, yes, the food item par excellence, the poor old Madeleine. And for the reasons I gave, I was fed up with Madeleine's, so I decided instead to say a few words in the book, quite a few words actually, in praise of the croissant. And the croissant is an important item for Marcel Proust. There's a compliment paid on it in the novel itself, which we haven't got time for, I think, for me to read out. If we had, I would. And then there's Céleste Albaret, Proust's last housekeeper, her famous memoir, in which she talks at great length about Proust's breakfast regime, his regimen, and it was always croissant. There's never a Madeleine anywhere in sight. There's occasionally a brioche, but it's croissant after croissant, and he'd have them not only for breakfast, but also for dinner, until in the end, he wasn't allowed to eat them anymore. So I thought, but this is still not answering your question. Yes, the Madeleine, why is this vulnerable to skeptical critique?
Well, in part because you point out that there were other original candidates for the Madeleine, including the biscotti and slices of dry toast.
Yes, well, that's part of the history of the compositional history of the Recherche. It's a very well-known item of the complex compositional history. Indeed, if you drop by the exhibition at the moment, the La Fabrique de la Recherche, the Bibliothèque Nationale, you'll get a shot of that kind of thing in massive dimensions. I'm exhausted this evening because I was there this afternoon, and it's just mind-blowing, and it's absolutely epic. I have never seen a literary exhibition like the one I saw today at the BN. But anyway, yes, sorry, about the contingency of the, look, sorry, I'm wandering a bit here, but to get it over with as fast as I can, there's a curious feature of the Madeleine experience in the first volume, early in the first volume, which is, it's alleged this triggers the whole of the rest of the Recherche in one way or another. But there's a very curious linguistic feature of the passage that describes the moment of the Madeleine, where the word chance, hasard, is used 3 times, not once, but 3 times in the space of the same passage. And what it is saying to us over and over, and is repeated elsewhere, not in connection with the Madeleine, but with other sensory experiences later in the novel, above in the final volume, Le Temps Retrouvé, which is implying that the Madeleine experience, which is fundamental to the very existence of À la Recherche du Temps Perdu, might not have happened. It was a matter of pure chance. It could have happened, it did happen, it did happen, but it could not have. And what I call in the technical jargon is called The Discourse of the Counterfactual. What I call the counterfactual, I wrote a book once about counterfactuals, so I'm a bit addicted to it. But what in this book about Proust, I call the Proustian counterfactual. There are several examples, many in fact, but the most important one is the counterfactual that accompanies the experience of the very existence of the Madeleine in the novel. This triple use of the word chance implies that it might never have been. And the whole counterfactualist side of the Proustian imagination is massively anchored in a poem that absolutely obsessed him, that he returned to over and over and over in the Correspondance. It's a poem by an English poet, Gabriel Rossetti, one of those poets, and it's called, I can't remember the title of it, but the first line of it is, "Look at me, my name is might have been." And it's that line that obsessed Marcel Proust. And the Madeleine episode is a massive case in point, an experience, an event, a moment that might not have been. But the interesting question is this: if there had been no Madeleine, does it follow from that there would have been no à la recherche du temps perdu? That is the thought experiment, or the question anyway, in the form of thought that I raise in Living and Dying. And there are other instances of the incursion of the purely contingent in the recherche that affects other dimensions of it.
Great, and let's also think about this repetition of the word chance, to think about other repetitions and this idea of the looping style, so Proust's looping style, and building the novel out of a system of spirals and circles too. Can you talk about Proust's and his geometry in the book? In particular, the Proustian horizontal, vertical, and elliptical. Thank you.
No, there's another chapter. One of the chapters in the book is fundamentally about the formal properties of the recherche as a work of narrative. And it's, yeah, as Alice just said, it's called The Geometer and the Weaver. The geometer image stems from Proust's famous comparison of the making of his novel with the building of a cathedral. It's another idea that he got from reading Ruskin, or part of the influence of Ruskin, and in which Proust effectively casts himself as both the architect and the stonemason, and try to follow up on this famous analogy. Proust, the narrative of artist who's also a builder of a building, and this took me to the place and function in the novel of geometric figures, the figures of the architect. The straight line, of course, we're all familiar with. It's the chronological unfolding of the story. It's linear, but of course it keeps digressing and looping. That is fundamental to Proust's narrative style, but the chronological sequence is nevertheless very real. It has a beginning and makes its way through to an end. But then there are the others. There's the vertical as well as the horizontal. The vertical is the geometric figure for the archaeology of memory, the way in which Proust keeps breaking off the narrative and plunging down into hidden layers of memory and experience. And then there's probably, for me, the most intriguing of them all, the transversal. Transversal line is one that intersects both the horizontal and the vertical, and is summed up by a physical image of the transversal in the extraordinary discovery that the narrator makes only at the end, when he goes to visit Gilberte in Tansonville in the last volume, when he learns from Gilberte that the two ways of Du Côté de chez Swann, the first volume, which are the locations of the family Sunday walks. One goes up towards the Guermantes country home, the other goes towards Swann's country home, and they are deemed never to connect. But he learns in the last volume that they do connect by this transversal path, petit chemin, that leads from one to the other, And it means that you could do the walk in a loop, in a circle, which is the final geometric figure, and the most important of them all, the circular forms of à la recherche, the way it does this looping movement from beginning and goes back to its own point of departure. And that has profound symbolic resonance, that figure. However, it has led to some misunderstandings. The worst has been to seize upon the geometric dimensions of the recherche, or the figures, as he's been baptized. All right, once upon a time he was baptized as the Einstein of the novel. In this incarnation, he's the Euclid of time. And that's just another ridiculous analogy. And I was very, very happy. Sorry, I have to relate this. When quite by chance, I was trawling around on the internet and I came across the announcement of a lecture in the States, in a campus in Cleveland. And the venue was called Euclid Avenue. But believe it or not, the title of the lecture was Proust and the Marx Brothers. And that really summed the whole thing up for me. And that was the point where I decided to leave the geometric ship. Yeah.
You made this joke in the talk that you sent me, but in the instance that time is dying, your book, Living and Dying, tell us about dying as it relates to Proust as we come to the end of our conversation before we open up to your questions.
Yeah, living and dying. Well,
so we'll hit, in other words, we're hitting hard on the dying section now.
Yeah, no, sure.
On the word dying.
Well, yes, well, Proust is as much, well, perhaps not as much about dying as about living, but he is fundamentally about dying and death. And it's written into the text from the word go. And one of the early Proustian maxims, we are told that we are born to dying and death from the moment we are born. It's there from the very beginning of being alive. And Proust enacts that maxim in all sorts of ways. Anyway, there are multiple deaths, of course, as we go along. Most of them are matters of report. And we come across Swann, for example, as mortally ill, but we don't actually witness his death. We're just told of his death. There are only two actual deaths actually staged in the novel. One is the death of Bergotte, the novelist, when he goes to see the Vermeer painting. And the other, of course, is the death of the grandmother, the harrowing, unforgettable death of the grandmother, which takes up a whole chunk of the novel and then involves, it's an experience so intense that it's immediately repressed, so that the young narrator is unable to grieve until later on he makes the second trip to Baalbek, bends down to undo his bootlaces, which is exactly what his grandmother used to do for him when they were first together in Baalbek, and it returns. It's the return of the spectre, it's the Lacanian return of the repressed, if you like, from the deep unconscious of something that was repressed because unbearable. So these are the fundamental death scenes in the novel, but there's one that intrigued me more than all of those, precisely because it never takes place, it is never mentioned, it is taboo, it is not allowed, and it's the death of Maman. Maman, the mother, does not die in the novel, but the reason she doesn't, she disappears from it. In the final volume, she goes to have tea with somebody called Madame Sazarat, as the narrator, now much older, goes to a party, the Prince and the Princess de Guermantes, the famous Bal de Tête gathering, and we never see or hear of Maman again. And so this raises the question, where did she go? I call it, from a narrative point of view, disappearing into a black hole. But it is impossible to resist the inference that where Maman has gone is to the grave. But it's unmentionable, it's unspeakable. But I speak of it, or I make Proust speak of it rather, in retrospect, by going back to La Fugitive, to the Venice sequence, where they visit the San Marco baptistry, and there is a sentence that I'd have to read out loud to make sense of what I'm now putting before you. This is the moment of the effect. It's a sentence is characteristically Proustianly complex, but it is unique and it is essentially the performing of a burial ritual. And the person who's being buried is mammal. But I'd have to read it.
Yeah, I'd love for you to read it. Yeah, I think that would be a nice way to, yeah. We can hear, let Proust speak.
Yes, right. Yes, it's just here. It's a very complex sentence in its structure because it's conventional in that it describes a narrative past, the episode, the Venice episode, but it also bears within it a projection forwards to a moment in the future that will become its own anticipatory point for looking back. The projection is the future projection of a retrospect yet to come. That's what makes it so intriguing. It is, for me, the most intriguing sentence in the novel, but that's its least interesting feature for me. It is, for me, also the most moving sentence in the entire novel. Here's how it goes in English translation. The French original here is absolutely magnificent. Anyway, the time has now come for me when, on remembering the baptistry, I cannot, he's in Venice in the Venice episode when he writes this sentence, but he's projecting forward to something yet to come, but which has actually happened. And he's looking back as the same time as he's looking forward. And in the act of looking back, he's effectively remembering somebody who is dead and buried. The time has now come for me when, on remembering and the someone is Maman, of course. The time has now come for me when, on remembering the baptistry, I cannot remain indifferent to the fact that there was by my side in this cool twilight a woman, this is Maman, clothed in mourning, she's still grieving for the death of her own mother, whose respectful but enthusiastic fervor matched that of the elderly woman who can be seen in Venice in Carpaccio's Saint Ursula, and that nothing can ever again remove this red-cheeked, sad-eyed woman in her black veils from the softly lit sanctuary of St. Mark's, where I am certain to find her because I have reserved a place there in perpetuity alongside the mosaics for her, my mother. And that for me is proof positive that Maman is destined for the grave, and she goes to the grave. And in fact, the real clincher here is the recent publication of the, what is it, the 75, the 75 feuillets that were discovered, been sort of hoarded up by Fallois, and one of these sequences in the feuillet is a riff on Mother, and it's ambiguous and uncertain, but it is impossible not to infer from it that what his narrator is describing is the death of the mother in the novel.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for Chris? So now we have about 15 minutes for your questions and comments. I'll refer you to Emily, who has a microphone. So please raise your hand if you have a question. We implore you. Yes. Yes.
The best thing I ever read about Alain de Botton was in a review of his book in the New Republic by Leon Wieseltier. It was a very critical, dismissive review, and he said he is what Oprah Winfrey would be if she had read Schopenhauer. Okay.
Well,
but that's
no, I know, but I've got to compliment you, or no, at least I've got to thank you for bringing this to the room. I was not familiar with this, but boy, it doesn't get me doubling down on the original take I had of poor old Ella.
And
I'd
your
love you to
question?
talk about the extraordinary influence that Ruskin had on Proust, and his worshipful relation to him and the extraordinary eloquence of his tributes to him. And in Painter's biography, the chapter is Salvation through Ruskin, but he never does say exactly what that is, what the nature of that salvation is.
Well, it has something to do with the cult of the beautiful. But there's another side to the Proust-Ruskin story, and it's very, very important. And it's completely and utterly different from the story that is normally told. Sorry, just to be briefly self-referential here, this hardly figures in the book Living and Dying, but it does figure centrally in an earlier book I wrote about Proust called Proust the Skeptic. Well, it's called Mirages and Mad Beliefs. Proust the Skeptic, Proust being skeptical of his own aesthetic that he derived in large measure from Ruskin, and the core of the doubt centers on something that Proust returns to many times in connection with his reading of Ruskin, the concept of idolatry, and that worshipping the beautiful can be a form of the idolatrous, and the idolatrous can be itself a form of seduction of which one has to be extremely wary. As the aesthetic solution to the problem of living may be a genuine solution to the problem of living, but it also carries with it its own traps.
Other questions? Yes.
For those who are starting out on the Proustian journey, is there an English language annotated volume that you'd recommend?
The Penguin edition.
Okay, no, it might be as basic as that.
Which you edit?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, there is one. Yeah, and it's the Penguin that I edited. Yeah. So, but I didn't do the annotations. I didn't translate it. I orchestrated. I was the general editor. I orchestrated it and assembled a team of translators, 7, 1 for each volume, and they furnished explanatory footnotes, notes, yes, to explain this and that.
And maybe
but it's not an elaborate scholarly work. No, it's not like the Pléiade at all, in terms of that kind of apparatus.
Maybe we can use this question. You can talk about the spat about translating titles that you wrote me about.
Huh. Well, ever since, look, the first English translation of Proust was Scott Moncrief's. Scott Moncrief is responsible, in my book, as somebody who spent many years working at the coalface of translating. I mean, I wasn't translating, I was supervising. I was the editor, but it took up a lot of my time and a lot of effort and so on. So I have huge respect for others who've had a shot at it. And for me, as I made plain in the introduction to the Penguin translation, that the hero, the true hero of the story of translating Proust into English is Scott Moncrief. However, it does not mean that Scott Moncrief is flawless. Far from it. And one of the issues of contention involves the titles. First of all, the title of the whole thing, À la recherche du temps perdu, translated by a pretty quotation from a Shakespeare sonnet as Remembrance of Things Past. Proust got to know of it, he detested it, and he protested, writing to his editor at Gallimard, I will not let the English ruin my book. And he had in mind not only the translation, Remembrance of Things Past, but also, and this is a huge bone of contention, I could detain you for hours over it, I've only got a couple of minutes. It's the translation of the title of the first volume, Du côté de chez Swann. Scott Moncrief translated it as Swann's Way, and it remained as Swann's Way through a whole suite of subsequent English translations until we got to the Penguin one. And the translator, my translator for Du côté de chez Swann was the very distinguished American woman of letters, Lydia Davis. And Lydia, one of the first things she said to me was, Chris, we cannot have Swann's way. It is not true. It is not faithful to the rhythm, the syntax, everything of Du Côté de chez Swann. And bear in mind here that the prime objector to that translation is also the first objector, Marcel Proust himself, because not only did he object to Scott Moncrief's remembrance of things past for À la recherche du temps perdu, he also objected to Swann's way for Du Côté de chez Swann. That's one of the things he meant by, in his letter to Gallimard, I will not let the English ruin my book. But it survived, and it went on and on through the years. It became a kind of icon, Swann's way, but Proust was made aware himself by his English contemporary Sidney Schiff, who alerted him to the fact that this is what the Scott Moncrief translation was to be, by saying that people are kind of, it's objectionable for the reason that people are thinking of Swann's way as meaning Swann's way, the higher road to wisdom, which of course is utterly and completely fatuous. And that is exactly why Proust himself objected to it. But it survived. But Lydia Davis comes along and she says, no, we're not having that. And with my 100% support, we're going to do it another way. And she translated it as The Way by Swans. Now, there's a certain clunky features to that translation. It is highly debatable, but in my view, it is 10 times superior to Swann's Way, and certainly a necessary corrective to the fetishizing of Swann's Way. And it generated, and I'll finish with this, an exchange in the columns, the letter columns of the New York Review of Books, subsequent upon a review by somebody called André Assiman, who teaches in New York City at the CUNY Graduate Center. In fact, he's my successor. I held that post for several years before I vacated it and he took it. Anyway, he reviewed the translation, the Penguin translation in the New York Review book, and he was very, very nasty towards Lydia. So I had to step in and write a rather aggressive letter in return, and he responded to that.
And Lydia responded.
And Lydia responded too.
You can find this all online.
So it's an ongoing bone of contention. But Assiman is also on record as saying, unbelievably, that Within a Budding Grave, which is Scott Moncrief's translation of Allons déjà une fille en fleurs, is not only an accurate but a literal translation of it, and therefore must be retained. We jettisoned it and had instead, what did we have? I've forgotten. No, no. What? Yeah. No, I suddenly lost it, and oh, damn it. And The Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, which is also Nabokov's translation of it. You know, one can debate that and have arguments about it, but this chap, Assiman, just decided to insult Lydia Davis, and he called it awful. Yeah, so that's that particular saga. I have strong feelings about it, as is obvious.
More questions? Yes, at the back.
Just to comment on that last point, I recently read a letter that Proust wrote to Scott Moncrief objecting to his titles. And he suggested that Swann's Way could be corrected by inserting the word to Swann's Way. And he did actually write that in a letter to Moncrief.
Yes, that is. I forgot to mention that. Thank you. Yes.
I don't know if this is, you know.
Swann's Way. I mean, by Swann's, you know, there are aspects of it to which one can object. One of the particularly ardent objectors is here in this room this evening. It happens to be my wife, who's sitting over there. But Two Swans just seems to me ridiculous. I mean, I just can't make sense of that.
Well, maybe on the way.
Du Côté de chez Swann, the rhythm and the syntax of that is simply not carried by Two Swans. And of course, it's if you are not reading it but you are speaking it, you know, it could be Mallarmé reappearing, only this time with deux cygnes, trotting around the lake. Sorry, that's a trivial joke. Two swans with all those other Proustian birds. Sorry.
Thank you. Wait, one more question.
Don't be shy.
Don't be
Yes.
shy.
I feel very shy, but can you say anything about the death, because you were talking about death of Brichot and the fact that he supposedly comes back? Is that an editing error? Or have you anything else to add to that? And also the little patch of yellow, quite a difficult passage after his death, and a magnificent death in the middle of an art gallery.
Yes. And it's not Brichot's, it's Bergot, who dies when he goes to see the Vermeer. No, there are two deaths reported in the Recherche that are mistakes, and not Brichot. The first is La Berma, the death of La Berma, the actress. Is the narrator opens a newspaper and reads the announcement that she's died, and not at all. I mean, she's going to have a party, which is the closing party of the Recherche in the last volume. Proust. Now we don't know. Oh, and sorry, the other one is the doctor. Sorry, the incomparable, unforgettable Dr. Cottard. And Cottard is reported is dead. He's died, but he turns up in the war sequence of the final volume, and he dies there from overwork. And there are two schools of thought here. I've had a debate myself in the Institut Français in London with the very distinguished Proust scholar Antoine Compagnon about this, and I maintain that Proust, this is a very interesting and funny example of Proust forgetting what is narrated. And Antoine said, no, it's not that at all. It's not that Proust forgot. It's that he was running a thought experiment, and he didn't know whether he wanted them to have died early or not. So he reports them as dead and then resurrects them. And if he'd gone on, if he hadn't clocked it in roundabout now in 1922, he would have revised the manuscript in such as to iron out the anomaly. And of course, we will never know the answer to that question. But I think it's the two reported deaths that are not deaths are those of La Berma and Dr. Cottard. Oh, sorry, and then, no, that's Bergot's death, the novelist, the fictional novelist. There are three fictional artists in the Recherche, a composer, Vinteuil, a painter, Elstir, who exercises a profound influence on the formation of the narrator's aesthetic views, and the novelist Bergot, who's also highly influential on the early literary thinking and experimental writing of the young narrator. Yes, Bergot goes to the exhibition of the Vermeer that is on loan from The Hague and has a heart attack, a stroke, and dies on the spot, and staring at this picture. But what he's staring at in particular, and mumbling really as he dies, is Le Petit Pont de Mur Jaune. He's absolutely entranced by this bit of wall that is part of the view across the canal or the river to Delft, which is the little patch of yellow wall. Proust was obsessed by it, and while on his own deathbed, he's revising like crazy. He's doing all sorts of things. I mean, he's reworking, he's massacring La Fugitive, such that editors for years and years and years really did not know which version was intended by Proust as the version. They finally figured it out. Well, they came to a view. Anyway, Proust is doing all sorts of weird things in the last days of his life with the manuscript. And one of them is jotting is, il y a quelque chose de chinois avec le pont de Mur Jaune de Vermeer. What did he mean by Chinese? Now I am trying to figure that out. not because I think I can get anywhere near what Proust might have understood by something Chinese, but it has some bearing for me on the question of Proust's interest in still life painting, which I mentioned earlier and referred en route. I went via Philippe's book here, Les Formes du Visible. And if I ever do this research, this piece of writing, either a short book or a long essay on Proust and still life, if I ever do it, the question that you have raised is one that I am definitely going to raise and see if I can make any sense of it. And I probably won't be able to, but it will be there in the work. Yes.